Hello everyone, Seadreen is the second 5-star character releasing in patch 4.7. Her kit received very few changes throughout this patch's beta, but nevertheless, I wanted to make one final guide covering her finalized kit, which was revealed in the official Genshin livestream. Releasing this a bit early before her actual release, I know, but I think it's nice to give you guys this info early so you can prepare ahead of time. And don't worry if you're watching this later on, everything is still accurate and up to date. As always, I'll be explaining how Seadreen works, the best ways to build her, her potential best teams, and analyzing her place in the meta in terms of overall strength and pull value. Pretty much everything you need to know with simple and practical explanations, while also giving more detailed analysis that is backed by TC. So with that, let's get right into it. Seadreen is a 5-star Hydro Bow user that is Uxia aligned in a sense with HP. Her primary role in teams is to be an HP scaling healer with a decent damage buff, and I will be focusing most of my discussion of Seadreen as a pure healing support. Seadreen also has a Bond of Life mechanic in her kit, but as you'll see, Bond of Life plays a very small role in how Seadreen works, to the point where you can kind of ignore it and Seadreen will still do her job just fine. To start off the kit overview, let's cover her normal talent. You will never use her bow attack, so you can just ignore this. Only things to note is that she throws pills with her normal attacks and shoots out bubbles while she's aiming a charge shot, so pretty funny and cute, but again, you won't use these. Next, her skill, which is Seadreen's entire kit as a healer support. However's made her actual skill description in an entire essay, but in reality, it's very simple, so I'll summarize the important points you need to know. When Seadreen presses her skill, which has an 18-second cooldown, she shoots out a bubble called Bolstering Bubble Bomb. This bubble bounces and hits enemies up to 5 times. The hit has a very small AoE and is also when the Uxia aligned arc damage occurs. If there are multiple enemies, the bubble bounces between them. Every time the bubble hits an enemy, the entire team except Seadreen herself is healed. After 5 hits, the bubble disappears and heals Seadreen for half of her max HP. Seadreen can also hold her skill and make her bubble bigger to up to 2 sizes. When bigger bubbles hit enemies, they have a slightly increased damage and healing and can imprison smaller enemies. Every time these bigger bubbles hit enemies, however, they decrease in size until they become back to normal. So if you fully charge Seadreen's bubble, the first 2 hits will be empowered while the last 3 will be normal. In addition, after Seadreen shoots out her bubble, she spawns 2 source water droplets. These are the same water orbs that Hydro Traveler and Nivulet spawn with their abilities. Seadreen can collect these orbs if she walks over them, and doing so gives her 10% Bond of Life each, so a total of 20% from the 2 she spawns. When she clears this Bond of Life off, which will automatically happen because her skill heals herself at the end, Seadreen gets some energy. As long as she collects both orbs and has 50,000 HP, she'll gain the maximum of 5 energy. Lastly, the skill itself generates 4 Hydro Particles and applies Hydro 3 times in single target. Particles are nice, but not too much off-field Hydro application. That's everything for the skill talent itself, but Seadreen's passives play a huge role in her skill. First, her A1 passive, which plays a big role in Seadreen's strength as a character. After Seadreen uses her skill, she gets 8% Hydro damage, which is pretty relevant, and 10 stacks of a buff called Convalescence for 18 seconds. This buff acts the same way as Shenhe's Quills or Xianyun's Plunge buff, and increases the damage of off-field elemental skill damage from your party, not including Seadreen's elemental skill. Each hit consumes a stack, so the Convalescence buff increases the damage of 10 total hits of off-field elemental skill damage. So units like Furina, Fischl, and Nahida get a decent damage buff to their elemental skill. It's nothing too insane like Xianyun's Plunge buff can get, but it's fine nevertheless. Keep in mind the 10 stacks of the buff are shared between the party members, so even if you have a team like Seadreen, Furina, Fischl, and Nahida, you aren't going to buff 10 hits from Furina, 10 hits from Fischl, and 10 hits from Nahida. You will only buff a total of 10 hits from off-field elemental skill damage, so you really only need one of these units on the team to get full value of Seadreen's buff. This buff scales off Seadreen's HP and maxes out when Seadreen reaches 65,000 HP. Next, her A4 passive. Seadreen gains increased healing based on the amount of Bond of Life the team has. Since Seadreen gains Bond of Life already by collecting the water orbs from her skill, as long as you absorb the 2 orbs and have at least 50,000 HP, Seadreen will get the 30% increased healing from this A4 passive, which is nice. Lastly, her passive talent is pretty unique for underwater exploration. When the active character gets below 50% HP when underwater, the resistances will decrease, but Seadreen will heal them for half of their HP, so cool quality of life for underwater exploration. Finally, let's cover Seadreen's burst. 70 energy cost, 18-second cooldown, and when cast, Seadreen sprays her syringe in front of her for 2.5 seconds, dealing a total of 6 hits of damage. Using the burst also absorbs 2 nearby source water droplets, synergizing with her skill. The damage is okay, but with its long field time and the fact that Seadreen will need to focus on HP for her support capabilities, in her primary role as a healer support, you're probably going to be better off not using her burst. Thus, you realistically only need to level her skill for healing and only prioritize her burst if you're aiming for a damage focused Seadreen. Thus, her gameplay will be quite simple. pressure skill, absorb water orbs for increased healing, and swap out. That's everything on Seadrine's base kit, so let's move on to her constellations. Her C1 does 3 things. First, it increases the amount of times her skill bubble can hit from 5 times to 8 times, thus increasing the skill's healing and hydro application. In addition, bigger bubbles won't reduce in size for the first 3 hits. And most importantly, C1 buffs the numbers of Seadrine's A1 passive, increasing the damage buff of off-field elemental skill damage from your party members. Pretty good constellation for increasing Seadrine's supportive capabilities. Seadrine's C2 is also a big buff to Seadrine's supportive capabilities. It gives a hydro shield whenever Seadrine uses her skill or burst, which is great for resistance to interruption. But also, whenever Seadrine's skill or burst hits enemies, it decreases their hydro res by 35%, which is a pretty big damage gain for hydro teammates. So overall, another strong constellation. C3 increases Seadrine's skill talent level by 3. C4 increases Seadrine's burst duration by 3 seconds. Effectively with C4, Seadrine's burst will hit 14 times instead of 6 times at C0. C5 increases Seadrine's burst talent level by 3. And lastly, Seadrine's C6 will give a ton of crit stats when she performs healing, which scales off her max HP. She will gain the maximum of 20% crit rate and 110% crit damage as long as she has 50,000 HP. So Seadrine's C1 and C2 are pretty strong to support her team, classic choreographers for making early constellations enticing, while the later constellations up to C6 are for people that really just want Seadrine to inflict a world of pain. Before I cover builds, I just want to quickly go over whether or not it's better to just go full HP support build or build some damage stats as a sort of hydro support with some sub DPS capabilities, as Seadrine does have a burst that solely deals damage and her skill healing also has some HP damage scaling. In addition, her kit has small damage buffs such as the hydro damage bonus from her A1 in her kit. I'll save you the trouble, don't build her for personal damage, just go full HP and focus on her healing and A1 buff. The reason is that building her for damage isn't worth it and gives you very little value for the investment. Just going over her damage multipliers, her skill only has a total of a 20.5% HP multiplier at talent level 10. In comparison, Yelan's skill has about double that multiplier and can very easily hit multiple targets. If we look at Seadrine's burst, sure it has a decent multiplier, but remember it costs 2.5 seconds of field time that can be used on another character that needs it. So in many teams it's just better to skip it. And most importantly, this multiplier doesn't matter if you don't have good crit stats and enough ER to burst. But if you have to invest in those stats, then you have less HP, so her buff and healing get weaker. So ultimately, from a meta standpoint, a full HP support build is going to be more effective and practical for teams. Thus, the build section will be focused on full HP support. But if you want to have fun with damage, then go get some crit stats, a Hydro Goblin, and potentially ER stats as well if you want to use her burst for damage. So let's go over her weapon options. Her signature is interesting because it gives a lot of HP, 66.2% as a substat and an additional 40% as long as Seadrine heals, uses her skill, and gains Bond of Life, which pretty much will be guaranteed if you play her normally. She can also gain 28% crit rate on her burst, but this won't be relevant for a full support build. Good for HP to maximize Seadrine's A1 buff and healing, but it's pretty much just an HP stat stick. And as a limited signature weapon, I just don't think being an HP stat stick is good enough pull value wise. One supportive weapon you can use is Elegy. ER substat for herself doesn't really matter, but the effects of the weapon make it useful for the team. Favonius Bow is another common supportive bow weapon, but I personally wouldn't recommend it. If you just skill and swap out of Seadrine, her bubble might not even hit the enemy before she leaves the field, so you don't get a chance to proc the Fav passive. And even if it does hit an enemy before she swaps out, you get one chance to proc the Favonius, maybe two if the Uxie aligned arc damage also hits at that time. At that point, it feels like a waste to invest in crit to make this consistent. So if you're not pulling her signature weapon that gives her a ton of HP, then you should probably go the 3-star weapon Recurve Bow. And I think for the majority of players, this will be her best weapon. It's just for the HP substat, but that's good in order to maximize Seadrine's healing and A1 buff. For artifact sets, you have 3 main options. Ocean Hued Clam is going to be her general best. Seadrine provides a lot of healing from her bubble bouncing around, allowing you to easily charge the 4 piece of clam and provide a decent amount of damage just by healing. This clam set is the actual way of making Seadrine a healer support with sub DPS capabilities. 2 alternative options are the other healing set, Song of Days Past and Tenacity of the Millelith. Song of Days Past is similar to clam but provides a slight damage buff instead, and if your team has attack scalers, Tenacity is a decent option since Seadrine's skill can proc it. For artifact stats, you just need to focus on HP, you won't need anything else, making her relatively easy and cheap to build. Seadrine's role as a Hydro character is to provide healing, some off-field Hydro application, and provide a damage buff to off-field elemental skill damage to the team. As a Hydro healer support, she serves a similar role to Kokomi, so Seadrine can serve as a Kokomi alternative or replacement. They both provide a lot of team healing, can utilize Clam to deal damage, and have some off-field Hydro application. However, there are some key differences which make them not completely replaceable with each other. First, their off-field Hydro application. Seadrine can apply Hydro 3 times in single target, while Kokomi can apply Hydro 6 times with one skill, not including refreshing it with her burst. Because of this, it is difficult for Seadrine to be in a team where she is the only Hydro and the team needs Hydro for their primary reaction. A good example of this is Freeze. Kokomi herself can apply enough off-field hydro for enemies to remain frozen pretty easily. With Seadreen, it will be more difficult, especially in AoE. Second, because Kokomi is a catalyst, she has the ability to drive reactions by on-fielding her with her auto attacks. For instance, Kokomi can be the only hydro to drive electrocharge teams with her being on field. Seadreen cannot. Thirdly, field time. As I've stated, Kokomi has the option of being on field. But if you don't need that option, then Kokomi still requires more on field time than Seadreen because she needs to burst to refresh her skill. Seadreen, on the other hand, only needs to skill, collect her orbs, then dip for the rest of the rotation. And lastly, Seadreen has a party buff with her A1, and being able to utilize this buff is a major reason to run Seadreen. Sure, Kokomi can buff by running TTDS, but it requires proper rotation to set up. So while Seadreen and Kokomi do serve similar roles, their purpose in teams can be quite different, with each of them having their own particular strengths. So knowing Seadreen's strengths and roles in teams compared to Kokomi, what are the best team options for Seadreen? Because Seadreen buffs off-field elemental skill damage and has low off-field hydro application herself, Furina is her best partner and will be a part of her best teams. Furina's damage gets buffed by Seadreen, Furina can solve the low hydro application issue with her own, and Furina can easily provide a ton of fanfare stacks with Seadreen's healing. So it makes perfect sense that their banners are running at the same time of Seadreen's release. If you don't have Furina, then replacing her with another off-field hydro like Xingqiu or Yelan still works, and effectively this double hydro core with Seadreen serves the basis of Seadreen's main team options. For the rest of the team, you have a ton of options. They may not be the most optimal version of the team comp, but the main thing Seadreen provides to her team is comfort, which is an important factor in team building. For instance, you can put Bennett Xiangling and the team is good enough. You can put Fischl Kazuha for an electrocharge team. You can slot in Nebula and Kazuha and the team still works fine as well. You can put Nilou Nahida for a Bloom team. You can go double cryo with like Wriothesley and Mika for a freeze team. You can go Nahida and an electro character like Raiden or Cloran for a working Hyper Bloom team. And lastly, I think her biggest potential is in a mono hydro team with Furina, Yelan, and Kazuha. Kokomi instead of Seadreen in this team is still good because Kokomi can on field, but Seadreen is still solid because of her A1 buff and because with Seadreen, Yelan can on field to buff her damage even more. The other team archetype is Seadreen acting as the sole hydro unit. However, because of Seadreen's low hydro application compared to Kokomi, she's generally worse at this role than Kokomi. For instance, in a freeze team, Kokomi will provide more consistent freezes. In an electrocharge team, even with Seadreen's burst, she won't be able to drive the reaction as well as on-field Kokomi. And in a double Dendro Bloom team, just having Seadreen and Nilou as your hydros is not enough for Bloom, so you need to go triple hydro solo Dendro with Nahida. The one team I can maybe see solo hydro Seadreen is good enough is in a double electro hyper Bloom team. But even in this team, you're not really gaining hyper Bloom, so at that point, you might as well just use an animal character and go aggravate instead. So while solo hydro Seadreen can work, especially if you don't have anyone else, it will be primarily for the healing and comfort. But from a meta standpoint, I don't suggest these teams and would highly recommend the double hydro variants instead. To conclude this Seadreen guide, I wanted to share my analysis on her place in the meta in terms of overall strength and pull value. With her role as a hydro healer support, she mainly competes with Kokomi, and although I consider Kokomi more flexible because of higher off-field hydro application and the option of on-fielding, which can be very useful in some teams, she doesn't completely overshadow Seadreen because Seadreen has a team buff and has shorter field time requirements. Because of her unique strengths, Seadreen is competitive with Kokomi, but the big problem is that the role of hydro healer support isn't that important in the current meta. The hydro slot is extremely competitive, so using a healer in that team with one hydro slot means you're not using units like Furina, Yelan, and Xingqiu, which is a big loss in damage. There are only a few teams that really like the hydro slot to be a healer like Freeze and Bloom. Unfortunately, Freeze is a pretty underwhelming team at the moment, and Bloom, while strong, will always have the caveat of not being too good at single target without the correct characters. Double hydro teams with Seadreen don't have this flaw, which is why I highly recommend them. However, these team versions won't be the best damage wise because Seadreen's A1 buff, while nice, isn't extremely game changing. Teams can be just as good and likely better if they use another element healer instead like Dendro or Animo, which give more utility by applying their element. As a result, hydro healers aren't that important in team building, and thus my semi-hot take is that Kokomi isn't an extremely strong unit right now, so Seadreen isn't that useful as well. Seadreen's biggest strength is her healing. She heals a lot, giving a lot of gameplay comfort, and this strength is important for a lot of players that have trouble surviving combat, an idea that I do think does sometimes get lost in TC. Ultimately, Seadreen's value and strength as a character really depends on whether you want this gameplay comfort or not. While she can be potent when paired with Furina, overall I don't think she's a very valuable character to pull unless you really want that healing comfort. That's everything I wanted to cover about Seadreen. I hope this guide and analysis was helpful to y'all in giving you a better understanding of everything related to Seadreen. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments, like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this video and want to see more guys like this in the future, and I wish you the best of luck on your Seadreen pulls.